The auctioneer's voice is a relentless hammer, each word a nail driving deeper into the suffocating silence of the room. 100,000. Do I hear 110? 110 from the gentleman in the back. 120? The numbers climb. Each bit a step on a ladder I never asked to ascend, yet here I am, teetering at the top. My hands are clenched in my lap, nails digging into my palms. The fabric of my cheap suit, bought specifically for its anonymity, feels like sandpaper against my skin. I can smell stale coffee and desperation, a perfume unique to places where dreams come to die. Or, in some cases, to be bought on the cheap. Across the room I see him.
Mark.
My husband. Or, well, soon-to-be ex-husband. He's leaning against a pillar, his face pale, etched with a fatigue that mirrors my own, though I suspect for entirely different reasons. His father, Arthur Miller, stands beside him, a stooped, gray caricature of the robust man I once admired. They look like shipwreck survivors, clinging to the last piece of driftwood. The driftwood, in this case, is Miller and Sons Hardware, their legacy, their pride, the business I poured my entire life savings into just before Mark decided our life together was no longer a sound investment. 200,000. The auctioneer's voice slices through my thoughts. Going once. My heart hammers against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My proxy bidder, a calm, stone-faced woman named Ms. Albright, gives a barely perceptible nod. 210, she calls out, her voice clear and steady. A ripple of murmurs. Mark's head snaps up. He scans the room, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes.
Panic?
Hope. He doesn't see me. I'm just another shadow in a room full of them. The bidding stalls. The air crackles. 210,000. Going twice. Arthur sags further, looking like he might crumple to the floor. Mark stares straight ahead, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He looks like he's aged a decade in the past few months.
Good. So have I.
210,000. For the third and final time.
Sold.
The gavel cracks down, the sound like a gunshot in the tense quiet. Sold to the representative of Phoenix Holdings. Mark blinks. Phoenix Holdings. A meaningless name. He looks confused, then a sliver of relief crosses his face. At least it wasn't a known competitor, someone who would gloat. Arthur seems to deflate entirely, murmuring something to Mark. Ms. Albright stands, turns, and her gaze meets mine. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod of confirmation. It's done. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me share these moments, these stories, more than you can possibly imagine. Just a year ago, this room, this scenario, would have been unthinkable. A year ago, I was happily married. Or so I believed. My life was normal, predictable, even. I worked as a mid-level project manager for a software company. Decent pay, long hours, but I was good at it. Mark and I had a small rented house with a garden I was slowly trying to bring to life. We talked about buying a place of our own, maybe starting a family once Miller and Sons was truly stable. That was always the qualifier, Miller and Sons. His family's hardware business. It was more than a business to them. It was a local institution, 3 generations deep. Mark wasn't just an employee. He was the heir apparent, the Sons in Miller and Sons. I loved Mark. Or I loved the idea of him, the man I thought he was. He was charming, ambitious in his own way, and he had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in his world. He'd bring me wildflowers he'd picked on his way home, leave little notes in my lunch bag. Small things, but they built a picture of a life I cherished. His family, initially, welcomed me. His mother, Carol, taught me her secret recipe for apple pie. Arthur would tell me stories about the early days of the store, his eyes twinkling with pride. I wanted to belong. I wanted to be part of that legacy, to support Mark's dreams. The store was his dream, or so he said. He spoke of modernizing it, expanding, making his grandfather and father proud. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. My own family was scattered, distant. Mark's family felt like the anchor I'd been searching for. So I invested. Not just emotionally, but I'd listened to his worries about stock, about competition from the big box stores, about cash flow. I'd offer suggestions. Sometimes he'd even take them. We were a team, or so it seemed. Our evenings were often spent with him poring over ledgers at the kitchen table, a frown creasing his brow, while I'd rub his shoulders and offer encouragement. "We'll figure it out, Mark," I'd say. "You always do." And he'd smile, a tired, grateful smile that made my heart ache with a fierce desire to protect him, to help him succeed. Little did I know, I was just a pawn in a game I didn't even realize was being played. The first real tremor hit on a Tuesday. I remember because I just landed a significant project at work, a career milestone. I came home buzzing, a bottle of champagne in my bag, ready to celebrate. I found Mark at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, the picture of despair. The usual ledgers were spread out, but this time they were accompanied by official-looking envelopes, red ink screaming from the pages. "What's wrong?" I asked, my celebratory mood instantly evaporating. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "It's bad, Sarah." "Really bad," he explained, his voice hoarse, that a series of bad investments made by his father years ago, coupled with a downturn in local construction and some aggressive tactics from a new chain store, had caught up with them. They'd been juggling loans, robbing Peter to pay Paul, but the music had stopped. The bank was calling in a major loan. Suppliers were threatening to cut them off. Miller and Sons was on the brink of collapse. "We're going to lose everything," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The house, the store, everything my grandfather built." His parents were devastated, he said. His mother couldn't stop crying. His father, a man I'd only ever seen as strong and stoic, was broken. The image he painted was one of utter ruin.
My heart went out to them. To him.
This wasn't just a business. It was their identity, their history. How could I stand by and watch it all crumble? Watch him crumble. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He named a figure. It was astronomical. It was coincidentally almost the exact amount I had in my savings and investments, a nest egg I'd painstakingly built over a decade, my security, my down payment for that future house we talked about. "There has to be a way," I said, more to myself than to him. He just shook his head, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. "There isn't. Not unless a miracle happens." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to Mark's troubled breathing beside me. I thought about my money, years of careful planning, sacrifices, late nights at work. Then I thought about Mark's anguished face, the genuine fear in his eyes. I thought about Carol's apple pie and Arthur's stories. This was his family. This was our future, wasn't it? If the business failed, he'd be crushed. We'd be crushed. The dream of our own home, of a family, it all felt tied to his stability, his happiness. By dawn, I'd made my decision. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, but I told myself love required sacrifice. I told myself this was what you did for family. I told myself it was an investment in our shared future. I was a fool. A romantic, trusting fool. The next morning, I told him. "I can help," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I have savings. Enough, I think. Or most of it." His head snapped up. His eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, widened. "Sarah, you can't. That's your money. Your future." "Our future, Mark," I corrected gently. "If the store goes under, what future do we have?" "This is too important," he protested, but it was weak. A token resistance. I see that now. At the time, I saw it as him being noble, not wanting to burden me. He let me persuade him. He let me talk him into accepting my help, my everything. He painted it as a temporary loan, something the business would pay back with interest as soon as it was back on its feet.
He swore it.
I, of course, believed him. The process of liquidating my assets was a brutal one. Cashing in stocks I'd held for years, emptying my high-yield savings account, even selling a small collection of antique jewelry inherited from my grandmother. Each transaction felt like a small death, a piece of my independence, my security, flaking away. But every time I faltered, I'd picture Mark's grateful face, the relief that would flood his features, and I'd push through. I told myself it was for us. When the final transfer was made, the sum directly into the Miller and Sons business account, the relief in the Miller household was palpable. Carol hugged me, tears streaming down her face, calling me their angel, their savior. Arthur, his voice thick with emotion, shook my hand, telling me I was more of a daughter to him than he could have ever hoped for. Mark held me close that night, whispering promises of forever, telling me I had no idea how much this meant, how he'd spend his life, making it up to me. For a few weeks, it felt like I'd done the right thing. The atmosphere in their home was lighter, almost festive. There were thank-you dinners, talks of a bright future for the store, plans for renovations now that the immediate crisis was averted. Mark was more attentive than he'd been in months, full of energy and optimism. He talked about new product lines, marketing strategies. I felt like a hero. I felt like I'd saved them. I felt like I belonged. The first hint that something was off came subtly. A shift in the wind, almost imperceptible. Mark started spending more and more time at the store, long hours, he said, trying to implement all the new ideas, get things back on track. It made sense, or so I told myself. He was driven, dedicated. But the calls home became less frequent. When he did come home, he was often tired, distant. The shared laughter over dinner, the easy conversations, they started to dwindle, replaced by a preoccupied silence on his part and a growing unease on mine. I'd ask about the business, about how my money was helping. He'd give vague answers. Things are picking up, it's a slow process. Dad's still a bit old-fashioned about some of my ideas, nothing concrete. No spreadsheets, no profit and loss statements like before. When I pressed, gently at first, he'd get defensive. Don't you trust me, Sarah? After everything? The accusation stung, and I'd back off, feeling guilty. Of course, I trusted him. Hadn't I proven that? Then came the excuses. Missed dinners because of supplier meetings that ran late. Weekends consumed by inventory or urgent repairs. He started smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, a sweet, cloying scent I couldn't place. When I asked, he said it was probably a customer or maybe something his mother used. Plausible deniability.
He was good at that.
The wildflowers stopped. The little notes disappeared. The man I loved was receding, like a tide going out, leaving behind a barren, unfamiliar shore. I tried to talk to him, to understand what was happening. Is it the stress of the business? I'd ask. Are you okay? He'd just sigh, run a hand through his hair, and say, I'm fine, Sarah. Just tired. You wouldn't understand. That phrase, you wouldn't understand, became a new, painful refrain. It built a wall between us, brick by brick. I started feeling like an outsider in my own life. My money was gone. And with it, it seemed, so was my place in his world. His parents, once so effusive with their gratitude, also became cooler, more distant. Carol's calls became less frequent. When I did see Arthur, his jovial warmth was replaced by a polite, almost formal courtesy. It was as if, now that the crisis was averted, my role was complete. I was no longer the savior, just
Sarah,
Mark's wife. And increasingly it felt an inconvenient one. The calls he made, when he thought I wasn't listening, were hushed, quick. Sometimes I'd hear a low murmur of laughter, not his own. A knot of dread began to tighten in my stomach, a cold, sickening premonition. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, stress. I was working longer hours myself, trying to recoup some of my financial losses, trying to distract myself from the growing chasm in my marriage. But the signs were there, like small, dirty footprints leading to an inevitable, ugly truth. I just didn't want to see them. The day it all shattered, the sky was an indifferent, perfect blue. Ironic. I came home early from work, feeling a rare surge of optimism. I decided I was going to fight for us, make one last big effort. I'd bought his favorite takeout, a bottle of good wine. I was going to lay it all out, my fears, my hopes, demand that we reconnect. I found him in the bedroom, a suitcase open on the bed. Not a small overnight bag. A large, gaping suitcase, already half filled with his clothes. My heart stopped. Just stopped. For a second, the world went silent. All sound sucked into a vacuum. Mark. My voice was a thread, barely audible. He turned, and his face was a mask. Not of grief or regret. Just resolve. A cold, hard resolve I'd never seen before. Sarah, he said, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. We need to talk. But I already knew. The suitcase was screaming the truth louder than any words he could utter. What are you doing? I managed, the takeout bag slipping from my numb fingers, its contents thudding softly onto the carpet.
I'm leaving, he said. Just like that.
No preamble, no apology in his eyes. Leaving? I echoed stupidly. Leaving for where? A business trip?
You didn't tell me.
He sighed, a sound of profound weariness, or perhaps irritation.
No, Sarah.
I'm leaving you. The words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, my hand flying to my mouth.
What? Why?
I don't understand. It's just not working anymore, he said, turning back to his packing, folding a shirt with meticulous, infuriating care. I haven't been happy for a long time. Not happy. My voice rose, trembling. When were you planning on telling me this, Mark? Before or after I gave you every penny I had? Before or after I saved your family's entire world? He flinched then, just a little. That has nothing to do with this. Nothing to do with it. I was incredulous. The sheer audacity of it stole my breath. You think my life savings, the fact that Miller and Sons isn't a pile of rubble right now, has nothing to do with this? He finally looked at me, a flicker of something, guilt? Annoyance? In his eyes. Look, Sarah, I'm grateful for what you did. The family is grateful. But that doesn't change the fact that we've grown apart. I need something different. Someone different. Someone different. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The perfume. The hushed calls. It all clicked into place, a sickening mosaic of betrayal. Who is she? I whispered, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a cold, hollowing despair. He hesitated. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. I screamed, the sound raw, torn from my throat. I deserve to know who you're destroying our marriage for, after I sacrificed everything for you. He ran a hand over his face. Her name is Tiffany. She works at the new coffee shop downtown. It just happened.
Tiffany.
A generic, pretty name. It just happened. As if it were an accident, a spilled drink, not a deliberate, calculated betrayal. And the money, Mark? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet now. My money? The money you swore the business would pay back. He had the grace to look uncomfortable then. The business, it's still recovering. It'll take time. Time you clearly don't intend to spend with me, I stated, the bitterness coating my tongue. So, what? You get your family business saved, a new girlfriend, and I get what, exactly? An empty bank account and a broken heart. He didn't answer. He just zipped up the suitcase. The sound was like a final nail in the coffin of our life together. He walked past me, towards the door, without another word, without a backward glance. I didn't cry.
Not then.
I just stood there, in the silence of our bedroom, the scent of his cologne already fading, replaced by the faint, greasy smell of the ruined takeout on the floor. I felt hollowed out, scooped clean, like a house that had been ransacked, all its valuables stolen, leaving behind only dust and echoes. The man I loved, the life I'd poured everything into, had walked out the door, and all I had to show for it was a receipt for a cleared debt that wasn't even truly mine. The days that followed are a blur of pain, a thick, soupy fog of grief, anger, and a crushing sense of worthlessness. Sleep was a battlefield I rarely won. When I did drift off, nightmares would jerk me awake, my heart pounding, the image of Mark's cold face, Tiffany's imagined pretty smile, seared into my mind. Food tasted like ash. My job, once a source of pride, became a monotonous series _of tasks I performed on autopilot. My colleagues noticed. "Are you okay, Sarah?" they'd ask, their faces etched with concern. I'd nod, force a smile, and murmur something about a persistent flu. How could I explain the magnitude of the betrayal? That my husband hadn't just left me, he'd used me, systematically, coldly, and then discarded me once my purpose was served. The financial reality hit hard. My safety net was gone. I was living paycheck to paycheck for the first time in over a decade. The rent on our small house, once easily manageable, now loomed large each month. I had to cancel my gym membership, stop buying anything that wasn't essential. Little luxuries I'd taken for granted were now impossible. Each small sacrifice was a fresh reminder of what I'd lost, of how thoroughly I'd been duped. His family, the Millers, who had called me their angel, were silent. Utterly silent. Carol didn't call. Arthur didn't check in. It was as if I'd ceased to exist. Or worse, as if I were somehow to blame for Mark's defection. Perhaps, in their eyes, now that the business was safe, I was simply an inconvenient loose end. The speed with which they discarded me was almost as painful as Mark's betrayal itself. It laid bare the transactional nature of their affection. I wasn't family. I was a resource. And my resources were depleted. Friends tried to rally. They'd bring over casseroles I couldn't eat, offer shoulders I was too numb to cry on. They'd rage on my behalf. "He's a monster. How could he do this to you?" Their anger was a pale reflection of the inferno burning inside me, an inferno I kept tightly leashed because if I let it out, I was afraid it would consume me entirely. But even their well-meaning support couldn't penetrate the thick wall of my desolation. I felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of my own making. I had willingly handed over my lifeboat, and now I was drowning. There were moments, dark, desperate moments in the dead of night, where I wondered if I could go on. The weight of the betrayal was a physical thing, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. What was the point? I'd given everything, my love, my trust, my financial security, and it had all been for nothing. Worse than nothing. It had been fuel for his escape. He'd used my devotion as a launch pad to a new life, leaving me broken in his wake. The shame of it was a constant companion, whispering insidious doubts about my judgment, my worth. How could I have been so blind? So stupid. Then one rainy afternoon, something shifted. I was sitting on the floor of my half-empty living room. I'd started selling off furniture to make ends meet, staring at a leaky patch on the ceiling, the drip, 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 a monotonous soundtrack to my misery. And a thought, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog. He will not break me. It wasn't a shout of defiance, more like a sliver of ice forming in the depths of my despair. The anger, so long suppressed, began to smolder, then to burn with a clean, focused heat. Not a destructive rage, but a clarifying one. The grief was still there, a dull ache that would likely never fully disappear, but now it had a companion, resolve. I started small. I got a second, part-time job waitressing on weekends, the irony not lost on me. I, who had bailed out of business, was now clearing tables. But the exhaustion was a welcome distraction, and the extra cash, however meager, was a tangible step towards regaining control. I started exercising again, long, punishing runs where I could channel my fury into pounding the pavement. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to rebuild. Not just my finances, but myself. One evening, I was idly scrolling through the local business journal online, a habit from my project management days. And there it was. A small, innocuous notice. Public auction, Miller & Sons Hardware. My breath caught in my throat. I read it again, then a third time. It couldn't be. I had saved them. My money had cleared their debts. How could they be up for auction? I started digging. It wasn't easy. The Millers had closed ranks. But I was a project manager. Research and persistence were my stock in trade. I made discreet inquiries, pieced together whispers and rumors. It turned out After I'd cleared their initial, critical debt, Arthur, with Mark's eager complicity, had taken out new, substantial loans. Whether it was sheer incompetence, a belief that they could gamble their way to prosperity, or perhaps a delusional expectation that I, or some other miracle, would bail them out again if things went south, I didn't know. What was clear was that they had spectacularly mismanaged the business into the ground again. Within months of my rescue, the new creditors weren't as patient. A strange, cold calmness settled over me. They hadn't just betrayed me, they'd squandered my sacrifice with breathtaking arrogance and ineptitude. The image of Mark, smugly walking out on me, flashed in my mind. The image of his parents, their false gratitude, and the icy resolve I'd felt earlier solidified into a diamond-hard plan. It wasn't just about revenge, though the thought of it was undeniably sweet, like a forbidden, dark chocolate. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming not just my money, but my power, my narrative. They had tried to write me off as a footnote in their messy story. I decided I was going to write myself back in as the goddamn author. The idea was audacious, borderline insane. By Miller and Sons? Me? I had barely enough to cover next month's rent. But the thought took root, an obsession. I spent weeks in a feverish state of planning. I researched everything I could about acquiring a distressed business, about auction procedures. I looked at the company's books, the publicly available parts, anyway, and despite the mess, I saw potential. The brand Miller and Sons still had goodwill in the community, battered as it was. The location was prime. With proper management, with a clear vision, it could be turned around. My vision. Financing was the biggest hurdle. Banks laughed me out the door. My credit was shot after depleting my savings. Then I remembered Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman whose small but successful accounting business I'd helped streamline pro bono a few years back, a side project I'd done just to keep my skills sharp. She was shrewd, wealthy, and had a soft spot for underdogs. She also had a healthy disdain for entitled dynasties like the Millers, who she felt gave small business owners a bad name. I prepared a meticulous business plan, leveraging all my project management skills. I laid out the company's failures, my strategy for recovery, projected profits. I was brutally honest about my personal stake in it, the betrayal, but I focused on the business case. I presented it to Mrs. Henderson over tea in her sun-drenched conservatory. She listened patiently, her bright, bird-like eyes studying me intently. When I finished, heart pounding, she was silent for a long moment. Then, a slow smile spread across her face. "My dear," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, "I believe in backing a woman with fire in her belly and ice in her veins. And you, Sarah, seem to possess an abundance of both. Let's give those Millers a lesson they won't soon forget." She agreed to back me, not as a loan but as a silent partner and investor. She'd provide the capital, I'd provide the sweat equity and the strategic vision. Her conditions were stringent, her expectations high but fair. If I succeeded, we both profited. If I failed, well, failure wasn't an option, I was entertaining. We formed a shell corporation, Phoenix Holdings. Apt, I thought. Rising from the ashes. Mrs. Henderson connected me with Ms. Albright, a formidable lawyer who specialized in corporate acquisitions and who would act as my proxy at the auction. The plan was to remain anonymous until the very last moment. I didn't want Mark or Arthur to have any inkling of my involvement. I wanted them to feel the full, unadulterated shock. The days leading up to the auction were a blur of adrenaline and anxiety. I barely ate, barely slept. I rehearsed the bidding strategy with Ms. Albright, went over contingency plans. There was a very real chance another buyer might outbid us, someone with deeper pockets. But Mrs. Henderson had given us a generous, but firm, upper limit. If it went beyond that, I'd have to walk away. The thought was unbearable. This wasn't just a business acquisition anymore. It was the culmination of my journey through hell, my chance to reclaim what was stolen from me, not just the money, but my dignity, my agency. On the morning of the auction, I chose my outfit with care. A nondescript charcoal suit, severe and professional. Hair pulled back in a tight bun. Minimal makeup. I wanted to be invisible, a ghost in the machine. As I sat in that stuffy auction room, watching the proceedings unfold, my heart thrummed a wild rhythm against my ribs. I saw Mark and Arthur enter, their faces grim, shoulders slumped. They looked like men already defeated, hoping for a small mercy, perhaps a lowball offer from a friendly face that would allow them to retain some shred of dignity, or even a minority stake. They didn't even glance in my direction. I was just part of the anonymous crowd. The bidding started low. A few tentative offers. Then Ms. Albright made her first bid, cool and confident. The price climbed. Each increment felt like a year of my life being reclaimed. My hands were slick with sweat. I focused on my breathing, trying to appear calm, detached. Mark was growing increasingly agitated, pacing slightly, whispering to his father. Arthur just looked older, grayer, more defeated with every raised bid. They clearly hadn't anticipated serious competition. They probably hoped to buy it back themselves for a pittance, using some hidden funds, or through a sympathetic third party. The field of bidders narrowed. Soon, it was just Ms. Albright and one other party, a local real estate developer known for buying distressed properties and flipping them, often gutting the original businesses in the process. My stomach clenched. If he won, Miller & Sons would likely cease to exist, its assets sold off piecemeal. As much as I despised what the Millers had done, a small part of me still felt a connection to the store itself, to the legacy I had tried to save. The developer made a strong bid. It was close to our limit. My breath hitched. I looked at Ms. Albright. She caught my eye, a tiny, almost imperceptible lift of her eyebrow. A question. I gave the smallest of nods. Go for it. This was it. 210,000, Ms. Albright called out, her voice echoing slightly in the sudden hush. The auctioneer looked towards the developer. Sir, do I have 215? The developer frowned, conferred with an associate, then slowly shook his head. He was out. My heart leaped. 210,000 going once, the auctioneer intoned, his gaze sweeping the room. Silence. Mark was rigid, staring at Ms. Albright now, a dawning suspicion, or perhaps just desperate hope, in his eyes.
He still didn't know.
He couldn't know. Going twice, the silence stretched, taut and unbearable. I could hear my own pulse roaring in my ears. For the third and final time, the gavel hovered. Sold. It came down with a sharp crack, a sound of absolute finality. To the representative of Phoenix Holdings. A collective sigh seemed to go through the room. It was over. Ms. Albright stood, a picture of composure, and nodded towards the auctioneer's podium to finalize the paperwork. Mark sagged against the pillar, his face a mixture of confusion and a strange, bleak relief. At least it wasn't the developer. He exchanged a look with Arthur, who just looked numb. They probably thought Phoenix Holdings was some anonymous investment firm that might, if they were lucky, keep them on as managers, or at least offer them consulting roles. The lesser of two evils, perhaps. Then, as per our plan, Ms. Albright stepped forward. The auctioneer, who had been shuffling papers, looked up. Yes, Ms. Albright? Is there something further? Indeed, Ms. Albright said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Phoenix Holdings is pleased to announce that its principal, the new owner of Miller & Sons Hardware, is in attendance today. She would like to be acknowledged. A ripple of surprise went through the attendees. Heads turned. Mark straightened up, his brow furrowed in confusion. Who could it be? Ms. Albright turned, her gaze sweeping the room, and then, slowly, deliberately, she looked directly at me. And she smiled. A small, almost predatory smile. Ms. Sarah Jenkins, please stand. Time seemed to stop. Every eye in the room swiveled towards me. I rose slowly from my seat, my legs feeling strangely unsteady, yet powerful. I could feel the heat of their stares, the collective intake of breath. I looked directly at Mark. His face. Oh, his face. It was a kaleidoscope of emotions, shifting, fracturing, then shattering. First, incomprehension. His eyes darted from me to Ms. Albright and back again, as if he couldn't process the information. Then, a flicker of dawning awareness, quickly followed by utter, stark disbelief. His jaw literally dropped. His skin, already pale, turned a ghastly, chalky white. Arthur Miller, beside him, seemed to shrink, his eyes wide with a similar horror. He recognized me. Of course, he recognized me. The angel. The savior. Now, apparently, the executioner. But it was Mark's reaction that I will carry with me forever. The color drained from his face completely. His eyes, wide and staring, fixed on mine. There was no anger there, no defiance. Just a raw, visceral shock, so profound it seemed to paralyze him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. His hand rose, vaguely, as if to ward off a blow. Or perhaps to reach out. I couldn't tell. And then his eyes rolled back in his head. His body, suddenly boneless, crumpled. He swayed, then collapsed, slumping against the pillar before sliding gracelessly to the floor in a heap. A woman screamed.
People gasped.
Arthur rushed to his side, shouting his name. Chaos erupted. But I just stood there, amidst the sudden pandemonium, watching the man who had shattered my life lie unconscious at the foot of a pillar in a dusty auction house. And I felt nothing. Or rather, a vast, cold emptiness where my heart used to be. The fire of revenge, so fiercely stoked, had burned itself out, leaving behind only ashes. And a strange, quiet satisfaction. The gavel had fallen. The debt was settled. Not the one I had paid for him,
but the one he owed me.
The aftermath was messy. Paramedics arrived. Mark was carted off to the hospital. A panic attack, they later said, severe vasovagal syncope brought on by extreme shock. Serves him right, was Mrs. Henderson's succinct comment when I told her. Arthur, looking utterly broken, trailed after the ambulance, shooting me one look of pure, unadulterated hatred before he disappeared.
Good.
Let him hate me. It was better than their false gratitude. The news spread like wildfire through our small business community. Woman scorned by his ex-husband's company. The headlines were sensational, unflattering, but I didn't care. Let them talk. I had work to do. Miller and Sons, or rather, Phoenix Hardware as I quickly rebranded it, was a disaster. The books were a labyrinth of debt and deceit. The inventory was a mess. Staff morale was non-existent. The Millers had run it into the ground with a breathtaking combination of arrogance and incompetence. But I had a plan. And I had Mrs. Henderson's backing and, more importantly, her faith. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. The first few months were grueling. 16-hour days were common. I pored over spreadsheets, renegotiated with suppliers, fired the deadwood loyal to the old regime, and hired smart, energetic people who believed in my vision. I modernized the inventory, launched a user-friendly website with online ordering, and started community outreach programs. I painted the dingy storefront a bright, optimistic yellow. Slowly, painstakingly, Phoenix Hardware began to rise. I learned that Mark recovered physically, but his reputation was in tatters. Tiffany, the coffee shop girl, apparently didn't stick around once his fortunes took a nosedive and his name became synonymous with scandal. He and his father tried to find work elsewhere, but the story of the auction, of my dramatic takeover, preceded them. They became pariahs in the local business world. Last I heard, Mark was working a dead-end job in another town, a shadow of the charming, confident man I once thought I knew. Arthur had retired, a bitter, defeated old man. I rarely thought of them. When I did, it was with a distant clinical detachment. They were figures from a past life, a life I had shed like a snakeskin. Phoenix Hardware thrived. Within 2 years, it was profitable. Within 3, it was a cornerstone of the community, known for its excellent service, quality products, and fair business practices. I made sure my employees were well paid, with benefits. I sponsored local youth sports teams, hosted DIY workshops. I built the kind of business Miller and Sons could only have dreamed of becoming, the kind of business I once naively believed I was helping them build. The irony was not lost on me. My victory was complete, yet it was bittersweet. I had my justice, my vindication. I had proven to myself and to the world that I was not a victim to be discarded, but a force to be reckoned with. I was stronger, wiser, and financially secure once more. But the scars remained. The ghost of Mark's betrayal, the memory of that all-consuming love I once felt, still whispered to me in quiet moments. I had won the war, but the battlefield was littered with the wreckage of my illusions. Love, I learned, could be a weapon. Trust, a vulnerability. But resilience, I discovered, was my armor, and I had forged it in fire. The satisfaction I felt wasn't a jubilant, fist-pumping kind. It was quieter, deeper. A grim, hard-won peace. I had faced the abyss, and I had climbed out, not unscathed, but whole. I had taken their attempt to destroy me and turned it into my triumph. Phoenix Holdings. Indeed, I had risen. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. The paths we walk are unique, but the echoes of betrayal, resilience, and finding our strength often resonate in familiar ways. Thanks for being here, for listening. Subscribing helps bring more of these stories to life, and I truly appreciate every single one of you.